So, good evening to everyone, and welcome to the Baumer series. My name is Eric Herman. I'm an assistant professor of architecture here at the Knowlton School, and it's my privilege to introduce tonight's speaker, Sarah Dunn. Sarah Dunn is the co-founder of UrbanLab, an architecture and urban design firm she founded with Martin Felsen in 2000. Sarah is a professor in the School of Architecture at the University of Illinois at Chicago, and she has also taught advanced studios at Columbia's GSAT. UrbanLab's projects span and implicate many scales, from regional mega proposals to residential projects and exhibitions. The Chicago-based practice's work has received both national and international recognition. Past honors include first prize in the History Channel's City of the Future competition and the American Institute of Architecture College of Fellows Latrobe Prize. In 2010, the Architectural League of New York included UrbanLab in their Emerging Voices program. UrbanLab has exhibited at the Venice Architecture Biennale in 2010 and 2012, and in Chicago's own Architecture Biennale in 2015 and 2017. The Biennial, I guess, in Chicago. UrbanLab work is also in the collection of the Art Institute of Chicago. UrbanLab's visionary urban prototypes are celebrated as fresh, vibrant, formally inventive, and graphically delightful, all while remaining tethered to a precise awareness of context, history, and disciplinarity. The practice recently published Bowling, Water, Architecture, Urbanism. As the practice's own take on the Architectural Manifesto, the book offers a series of speculative architecture projects centered around the organizing role of water. Water, like architecture, is often experienced as discrete, but as part of a continuous system made incomprehensible by the sheer planetary scale and complexity of its systems. The Bowling Project asks broadly, quote, why, as a discipline, do contemporary architects counter huge crises with small ideas? UrbanLab's speculative work is framed further by the repeated frame of two hypotheticals. First, why not architects? And second, what if? Whereas a rhetorical question will close a conversation just to make the point, the hypothetical opens it. It asks the audience to suspend disbelief and elicits responses. As UrbanLab often does, the hypothetical can be a useful tool to displace the focus of inquiry from technical facts to cultural matters. Hypotheticals are often rehearsed as means for exploring possible futures, but they're equally helpful to reconsider the shape of our past. And perhaps this symmetry points to UrbanLab's active use of both history and future in their projects. Their work deftly tackles, amongst many other issues, the infrastructural legacy of Burnham, the plan of Chicago's grid, and the political climates, both past and present, that are repeatedly challenged by ecological crises. They build on techniques introduced by past architects, theorizing responses to huge problems, such as superstudio or the metabolist. UrbanLab's work is extensively research-based, but it doesn't offer technocratic solutions, instead speculating alternative scenarios with prototypes for living marked by inventive language, thoughtful planning, and considered implementation. Importantly, UrbanLab projects often conflate disparate landscapes, typologies, or programs that have been compartmentalized or sequestered in contemporary development patterns. So in this way, UrbanLab's work occupies, thickens, transgresses, redirects, and disentangles the literal and metaphorical edges and binaries of the contemporary metropolis. The edges cleaving local and global, living and working, city and environment, land and water, urban and rural. These edges are not only the contours of development patterns, but potential fault lines in other cultural divides. Divides that UrbanLab works to overcome with architecture that suggests new lifestyles that might help us all more consciously and collectively pursue a shared contemporary urban life. We are, after all part of the water constituency. And for me, this is the most important and revelatory lesson of UrbanLab and its Bowling, that water, like architecture, is a ubiquitous medium that binds us in ways that are both entirely obvious and often completely unexpected. Please join me in warmly welcoming Sarah Dunn.
Well, I was about to say thank you to Eric. That was a really nice introduction, and I really have nothing more to add. Just kidding. But yeah, that was great. Thank you for having me back. I actually was here in 2011, which is now quite a number of years ago. And it's very nice to be back to talk about both the book and to talk about other work that we're doing in the office. I thought I would kind of break the talk up into two parts. One is about really theoretical projections of as Eric mentioned, how we might reimagine how we deal with landscape, infrastructure, architecture in a new way around water, or in maybe not new way, but around water. And the other is kind of the nitty-gritty of what else we do when the wheels hit the road and we have an architectural practice, and how do we try to find connections between the two of those things. So as Eric mentioned, I just came out with the book, but actually now it's about 1.5 years ago. It took a really long time, and when I was looking at the lecture that I gave here in 2011, some of the projects are in it. It just took us a really long time to organize it into a book. And I recommend, if you ever do a book, don't write any essays. Just we're all really good at the pictures. Writing is hard. So the book speculates that we can hybridize architecture, infrastructure, and landscape, and that these hybrids combined with cultural desires, because as architects, what we're good at is articulating the cultural and marrying that with the technical, but that is what differentiates us from other professions that deal with making the built environment. And together with the combining hybrids and cultural desires, we might actually stumble upon design innovation. Our goal for all of our projects, actually for both projects that we do, tiny lobby renovations, all the way up to the design of cities, is always to produce new lifestyles and to support existing lifestyles that we feel might be under threat, as well as create new forms of collective association, which means new publics, new public space, new ways to be together in architecture. We often look, as Eric mentioned, to the past, the recent past of groups like Super Studio, who were looking at the crises of their time. In the 50s, 60s, there was a lot of worry about population growth. Also, there was worry about sustainability and environmental concerns. Those continue with us today. This is a project Super Studio did when Florence flooded in the 60s, and they made this collage about how would you deal, in this case, kind of critically with that flood. They did these crazy collages which really inspire us to think in bigger ways than we might have before. So also kind of why bowling? Actually, another thing that turns out to be really hard in doing a book is the title. It's really hard, actually. So why bowling? It was sort of a struggle of what we were actually doing. We came up with these rules, and we realized that everything we were doing was like literally, and it sounds really dumb, and it is dumb, and one of our rules is bowling is dumb. Number 6. They were literally starting from the idea of the watershed. The watershed is literally a kind of a bowl shape that exists in nature, which is organizing the water systems of the world. So we're proposing a system of bowls and making bowls, which is how we come to the idea that we're bowling. And these bowls are cultural bowls as well as technical bowls. This is the example that we often use. It's a project that we did with Stanley Tigerman a number of years ago to give to the city to rethink some of its issues. And for example, this is a problem that we have at least a lot in Chicago, which is that we have just a lot of empty space that was formerly dense with neighborhood and is now sort of evacuated by parking. So this is kind of the insidious creep of parking that in our minds is devastating a neighborhood. There's other reasons why this neighborhood is under stress, but one of them we posit is because the United Center, which is where our winter sports teams play, the Bulls and the Blackhawks, so basketball and hockey, and they, over time, have basically expanded their parking at the expense of the surrounding neighborhood, and what you get is a huge amount of parking. It is a bowl of parking, and our proposal was to actually not eliminate the parking, but give it a reverse growth boundary so that it can't go any further, but that the neighborhood could then start to kind of heal itself back to this boundary. And the boundary we proposed is a thickened zone that is not so much wall, but is actually an occupied giant building made out of a Chicago prototype called the 3-flat, which is sort of stacked together, has figure. We're pretty interested in always kind of inventing a kind of figural quality to our projects, aggregates together and becomes a kind of almost sponge that rings the United Center. Parking still stays there, but the neighborhood zone around it, which is currently, no, maybe? Oh wait, there. Currently kind of empty, could, oops, didn't work. Grow itself back, and this is not working. Maybe I have some problems with the file, but would grow itself back to the edge of that kind of sponge building. So that's how we get bowling. And then we also like bowling, so bowling. So the book is organized into a number of chapters. The first half deals with so process, form, and organization. The first half deals with the eastern side of the United States, and the second half deals with the western side of the United States. So on the eastern side of the United States, east of the Mississippi River, we actually have plenty of water in most cases, especially in the Great Lakes region. We have 20% of the Earth's fresh water on deposit in the Great Lakes, so we don't have a problem of scarcity. We actually have a problem of stewardship. And on the west side of the United States, we have a problem of scarcity. So we break this into what do you do with a lot of water and what do you do with not enough water. And how do you do it in such a way that you not only kind of solve technical issues, which other professions can solve just as well, but how do you leverage that into creating new possible publics, new ways to live? So how do you make it a cultural project? And bowling does a number of things. It makes bowls, forms figures, and also organizes programs and services. Like, here's a bowl example. So I'll just go through. We have lots of writing, which took way too long. Oh, this is an interesting example of what you do when you don't manage your resources well. This is the Aral Sea, which is in the former Soviet Union in Kazakhstan, in which engineers and politicians at the time of the USSR decided to favor agriculture over fishing and diverted water from the Aral Sea. And so it depletes very quickly, fourth largest body of water in the world, and now is no longer. You could see the brackish water and the fact of kind of extreme devastation, which you don't have to be a scientist to kind of see. And that's what happens when water systems are not taken care of. Now they have these big storms of sand. But what you could look at as a kind of more positive intervention is what happened in Ascension Island from 1835 when Darwin and his ship landed in the island. And turned actually through kind of productive insertion of new plant species, turned what was a kind of desert island into a tropical paradise. So we've been designing our landscapes and our environments for quite a long time. So we have to be obviously very careful in how we do it, but sometimes we can actually do something right. And so this has gone from something that was formerly barren to something super lush. What he did was, with some associates, brought in a series of different types of plants and planted them at different elevations, and they kind of took over. And it goes from, again, a desert to a lush landscape. So we don't propose this extreme amount of intervention, and our projects are very theoretical, and we're not expecting them to actually happen. But what we are interested in is furthering the conversation to think about what if we did rearrange the city in a different way. So projects, this one is about Chicago and the various areas in Chicago which are losing many manufacturing jobs. We propose to make a free water district in these areas and propose that other cities around the Great Lakes could do the same, and almost make a kind of a new system where companies could come to the city in these free water districts, set up shop, use as much water as they want, which is pretty controversial, but they would be responsible for restoring the degraded landscapes that exist there now, the brown fields that are left after our industrial revolution, and to clean any water that they don't use and put it back into the Great Lakes. So this is like a project that actually started through a competition, kept going, was of interest to one of our previous mayors, and lives on as a kind of idea that can be thought about, and we think about it actually in our practice. Even though this is a theoretical project, we think about it in our practice as a kind of real thing. This is actually, we exhibit at the 2012 Venice Biennale. And so, again, this particular bowl is both a kind of technical bowl in that it organizes water, but also a kind of cultural bowl in that it also organizes new social systems and introduces new possibilities for how to live in Chicago. So this particular section is cutting through a proposal that would happen in the center of the project, which would be this new R&D university that would kind of organize all these new manufacturing plants around it and would provide jobs and training for the neighborhood. And so this is kind of maybe what it might look like afterwards. We're always interested at figure and field. Sometimes what we're producing is at the scale of a city, and it might be a figure at a very large scale. Then you zoom in, it's at the scale of a field, and then again, a figure is up close. This project started the whole thing, in which we thought about how currently Chicago takes its water out of Lake Michigan and does not put it back. We're the only city on the Great Lakes that takes water out and doesn't put it back. We actually put it into a whole different watershed. And in the Mississippi watershed, it ends up as part of the problem flowing into the Gulf of Mexico with all the pollutants that are flowing and creating these issues in New Orleans. So a long time ago, 100 years ago in Chicago, we actually kind of made a cut. We actually reorganized the bowl system, and we connected ourselves as a link between the Great Lakes watershed and the Mississippi watershed. And this is the main reason for Chicago's success, is that, in fact, you can, for example, ship something from New York down to New Orleans, and it will go through Chicago, and Chicago will somehow benefit from that. So that actually was the economic generator or driver of Chicago for still. But the side effects that it produced are extreme. So we're pulling out gallons and millions of gallons of water every day, and we're not putting them back. And so our proposal is actually to use the organization of the city itself to collect that water, clean it, and put it back into the Great Lakes. So much of the water that's pulled out is used for a variety of purposes. Our city is organized on a grid. We propose to actually use the grid to take water that's used and then cleaned and put it back into the Great Lakes. So every east-west street, every half mile, an east-west street would become a boulevard by which we could transport clean water back to the Great Lakes. These are, it's pretty extreme to propose to Chicago to replumb the whole city. So obviously, we had to rethink. But the ideas here come up in future projects, which I'll get to. I need to go a little bit faster. But this is a kind of street before and a street after on the right side. A street before being an eco boulevard and a street after. And you can see in the eco boulevard, the street is still functional as a street. There's less lanes and the parking is different. But there's ways to kind of collect the rainwater and stormwater and collect actually wastewater and clean it and slowly put it back into the lake. And how it might affect how we live in the city. Every Chicagoan would now be only a quarter of a mile from a amenity that is connected to the lakefront. So in Chicago right now, people who live close to the lakefront have a lot of amenity in that they have a beautiful landscape. But there's many people who actually are very disconnected from the lake. This is basically drawing the lake amenity through the city at every half mile, so you're only about 10 minutes walk from this amenity. So it's a project that's trying to be more egalitarian about our resources. And so after that, we started thinking about, well, if we can't replumb the whole city, maybe we can plumb little parts of it. We started thinking much more micro, little elements that could be popped into a couple of parking spots, and would propose to actually clean the wastewater of a kind of a single block. And so this you could do incrementally over time, a lot less of a big infrastructural change, but always we're interested in leveraging the investment into infrastructure with the investment into the cultural. So each one of these is also something else. It's a bike station or a bus stop, or even potentially, a swimming pool, which, let me get to that, which with all the clean water that you have in excess could become something that you have never had in the city before, a little swimming pool on your block. And these would be cultural markers. They'd be little figures in the neighborhood and sort of go throughout the neighborhood as a way of kind of signifying where you are in the neighborhood. So we also started thinking about our extreme rain events that happen now. They're supposed to happen once every 100 years, but the 100-year rainfalls seem to happen with much more frequency at this point, and there's obviously speculation as to why. Currently, we take all of our storm events and we house it here in this giant hole in the suburbs, and it's pretty cool, but it's a hole in the suburbs, and could be so much more. But it is pretty cool. So we propose to actually take that infrastructural investment and to reorganize it and put it actually not in the suburbs, which is not where the problem is, but in the center of the city, at the mouth of the Chicago River and other rivers in the region, in order to, when the city has a big rain event, 100 years ago, as I just said, we take all of our water, we collect it, and we put it down the Mississippi River eventually. But when we have a giant rain, we can't actually process the water fast enough. So often what we do is we just dump it into the river. And so then we get really gross stuff in the river. And then when the river gets really full, we actually open the locks and send that river into the Great Lakes, into Lake Michigan, which is really bad because that's also where we get our fresh water. So we proposed in a kind of Burnham-esque manner, and I'm not sure if you know about Burnham's ideas for Chicago, the 1909 plan in which he proposed, and this is the kind of result over here on the left, reorganization of, he didn't only invent the lakefront and the kind of Beaux-Arts amenity that it is, but actually he was proposing transportation infrastructural changes, water infrastructural changes, very many different things that actually don't really get thought about. What really gets thought about when people say the Burnham Plan is the kind of physical park that is the sort of center of the city. So we're proposing at the scale of the Burnham Plan to think about how we could take water and clean it before it gets dumped into Lake Michigan. So at very large rain events, ooh, okay, there's a plan. It's not showing up in the way. Let's see, okay, you have to take my word for it. The city would collect all its water rather than in the suburbs here, clean it, and then put it into the lake. And in the kind of cleaning landscape would also be all these cultural programs from skate park to art museum to wetland, bird watching sanctuary to concert venue. And these would be kind of integrated within the landscape of water cleaning. Okay. We did this model actually for the first Chicago Biennial, which is, I think, the only way I'm going to be able to show you what it looks like because my plans aren't showing up, but it is this very figural thing which takes on qualities from the Burnham Plan and repositions them in order to make a new public amenity that is both doing a technical thing, but at the same time bringing people together in public space. And this is some images of close-up what these, it's pretty abstract. Those little cones are trees, and the crazy gradient things are architecture. It's not, yeah, anyway. And then landscape, and then blue is obviously water. And then this is at the mouth of where the water is at this point clean and goes into Lake Michigan. Oh, here, also, so this is during a rainy moment where the park is filling up with water and it will be cleaned. And then this is a kind of moment where it's drier, it's not raining anymore. So you see the Burnham Plan beyond, and you see this kind of Burnham Part 2 that we're proposing. And then, as I said, the second half of the book is about Death Valley and the Southwest. And it's even more crazy than the first half. And we propose to think very seriously about water shortages and sea level rise, and think about what could you do if you actually flooded Death Valley. And we're not really proposing to flood Death Valley, but we're proposing to think about what if you did. What if you thought about different ways to live in the Southwest? Living perhaps more communally and living in a way that collects water into these depressions which exist in the Southwest that can hold water. Could you then imagine new ways to live and have a kind of excess of water, which the Southwest has never had? So it entails designing an aqueduct which would pull water from Baja California and pull it up into the valley, into Death Valley, and be both a technical thing of bringing water and desalinating it, but also be a place for living together. And again, we're pulling, this is our collage, this is Super Studio, We're totally ripping them off, but they're okay with it. I got it in writing. Got their blessing. But so what can you, how can you productively engage with the crisis of the environment that we have right now? What can you think about? Actually, this is a model that we made for the Chicago Biennial in 2017, in which we're looking at kind of the elements of the super studio elements and our elements, in which we propose this aqueduct that you can live on and under and above. And it was super popular on Instagram, which was also one of our goals. And so this is the different ways that you could live with this aqueduct, and this is the kind of flooded Death Valley, so this is all now fresh water. We looked at town morphologies and how could you create a new type of town. This is our version of the town, so you see the aqueduct going through, and you see these basically town houses, which all kind of packed together, and of course it's super hot there, and shade is actually where you want to kind of do public space. So this is a diagram of all the shaded public space that would be available in this new town. Here's the aqueduct going through it. We made all these drawings. We also designed all of these housing elements, which are shown in orthographic projection up here. So we designed all of these kind of tiny little elements that come together and make this town, and then projected how you might kind of exist in these spaces and living mostly in the shade because it's really hot. How you might do a more urban scale aggregation of living above and below the aqueduct, and thinking about again the kind of housing elements and different programs and how they fit together. And this is kind of some of the work in the book that we look at and how you design for the extreme climate. One side is north facing, and the other side is south facing. So one side is in shaded, and the other side doesn't necessarily have to be so much. Again, sort of inventing all of the housing elements that might fit together to provide enough places to live and ways to live. So 1 bedrooms, 2 bedrooms, condos, hotels, old folks' homes, all sorts of things. And how that kind of aggregates together to form a new urban scale figure. And this is another drawing that we made of that. So again, we're really super interested in that kind of public zone in the middle. And then we also looked at the suburb and how could you productively marry aquaculture with the suburb in this situation, and produce these suburbs that are both places to live but also places to work. And the ground plan is where you are harvesting a variety of aquaculture-based systems, and then above on the second level, how you're living kind of above that and forming a kind of mat building, looking both above and below. So the bottom part of the drawing is kind of a worm's eye, and the top is a top down. And always interested in how these elements kind of work together. And so you would get this kind of giant mat building that actually, in the experience of it, would still be pretty suburban, and we thought an interesting way. And this is how you might live in that suburb, kind of like John Wayne, out in the desert, but with lots of water. So that's kind of one part of our project, and I'm going to switch to the other part, which is what we also do. And so we take that work, so we do that work, we're always doing that work. Sometimes it's solicited, often it starts as a solicited thing, and then the thing is over, like it was a competition, the competition ends, and we keep going, and we keep kind of thinking about it. and working it. So many of those projects started as either a competition or some kind of workshop of some sort, and sometimes they just, we invented them completely on our own. But then they start to inform some of the projects in the office, even the very small ones, I think. Maybe not so directly, but indirectly. So I'm gonna start the kind of projects that we actually do in the office that are sort of, we sort of do approach all the projects in the same way. So even though I've split the projects in half in this lecture, we approach them the same way. And so even on something as small as a house, we're still interested in new possibilities, and you can argue how new are some of these possibilities, but trying to engage in the cultural project of architecture by looking both backwards at how other architects were inventing new ways to live and projecting with this knowledge forward, always in the search of what is the kind of lifestyle ramification of that. So this is a project that when I looked at the lecture from 8 years ago, I showed this house. So this is one of our longest running projects. It's actually a house for my brother, so that's why it's taking a long time. And he actually lives in it now, but still not done. So this is a rendering of it. This is what it's supposed to look like, but it doesn't quite look like that yet. So this house is at an interesting, on a hillside. It's LA, so it's very hilly in parts, and it has like two beautiful views, one to the Hollywood sign, which is, you know, the classic LA view, and one to the mountains, which are also super beautiful. And our initial idea, and the idea that we kind of pushed all the way through, is to kind of tweak the understanding of the landscape and to kind of embed a private kind of bar of living into the landscape, or at least make it feel like that, and then underneath that have what we think of as kind of a more publicly oriented group space, like the living space underneath that, and to do those two things within a budget and for a family client, and then have that person, my brother, be the GC, and he's not a GC. So it's a little bit tricky, and that's why it takes a long time, but this is the kind of diagram, the model, that is kind of what we were going for, and sort of the normal things in the house of living space, garage, living spaces, bedroom spaces, and then how it kind of fits into the landscape. This is what we want it to look like. This is kind of what it looks like right now. It doesn't really quite have the facade on it, so I'm gonna keep going so you don't see that. But this is what it currently looks like, and so it's just down to the skin on the upper level, which is trying to kind of do something of holding the whole thing together. But so I think in this project you kind of see our approach to architecture at the small scale, how we try to organize architecture with landscape, and not necessarily infrastructure in this case, but that we're trying always, even at the small scale. And I've here whited out all the elevations that I don't like, so it looks, it doesn't exactly look like this, but someday it'll look a lot better. But this is what it, and the photo's kind of blowing out. You can't see the Hollywood sign, but take my word for it, it's over there. And then the hills are kind of around the side. So this is kind of maybe at a super small scale, what we're thinking about at a purely architectural scale. And someday that won't be whited out. And then sort of going up in scale. So these are all sort of going up in scale. The brick house that we did in Chicago, also constraining sort of project in that it's a large house, and made even larger by the fact that all the houses next door to it are very small. But how, again, sort of can we organize landscape together with architecture so that you get this possibility of living both with landscape and with architecture, and here kind of lowest level peeling up to become a hill. We actually hired, because our own house and office, we created a hill, and the client saw our hill and decided that he wanted one too. And so we made them one. And this, I think I have a photo. We got to have fun with brick, and it was trying to kind of dematerialize the massive quality of the house, but the house is still pretty massive. But here you see the landscape that's kind of coming into the house. There's also landscape carved out from on top. This is a courtyard at the top level of the house, and here's the hill that hides the parking garage underneath, and then produces a kind of play space for the kids, and dematerializing even into the stair. So we have this kind of perforated metal stair that folds all the way up to the top floor, and it's a little bit scary when you're on the top looking down. So that leads us to this house, which is actually in construction right now, which is a smaller, more modest version of that, and trying to kind of, again, look at how we can live in kind of new ways in the city. It takes the typical Chicago house and just kind of messes around with it a little bit. Typical Chicago house is kind of maxed out. There would be no removals, but we convinced the client to make this kind of courtyard on the second level and push the first level back and carve out the bottom level so that we could just make a few tweaks in the normal course of Chicago architecture in order to try to make this house a little bit different, a little bit more, with more possibilities of living in the spaces. Let's get to this. So it's in construction now. I think they just did the installation today, so I don't have any photos of that. Eventually, these will give way to something finished. Here's a much smaller version of kind of connecting the landscape at the back of the house. We are interested also in just kind of the very banal Chicago views that you get in Chicago when you look sideways. Most of the time, houses are organized in the narrow front and the narrow back to kind of look either at a really kind of ugly alley or at a pretty nice street. But we're pretty interested in the side views that are usually not considered. So we're looking at that. And then kind of going up and getting a little bit more public. And this is a renovation of an existing building, so I'm sort of getting larger in scale. And in this one, also looking at the possibilities of both living and working here. The clients were interested in having a perfect, and in fact, this gallery is actually golden sections, so they were really interested in a kind of perfectness of it. And in smaller galleries, but what we spent a lot of time with them was on the kind of private space and the kind of living space, and how can you make a gallery also feel welcoming and cozy, even though it's pretty neutral and cold. So designing in that way, sort of thinking about how you spend your whole work week here, how do you almost live in it, to the point where the private offices in the back are modeled after a kind of a living room type of space. And this is that space, and then the kind of back of house also. Right now we're doing another building for not the same kind of client. This is a landscape company that does their what they do is they pretty much do all the green roofs in Chicago, and we met them because they did our green roof, and we've been friends ever since. And so they wanted a very green, like literally green building. and their company is called Intrinsic. And so they got this building, and we're doing an extreme renovation of it. And they are basically, they want to showcase their work, but we don't want it to seem very showcasey. We want it to seem much more organic. But this is in construction right now, and the kind of interesting thing about it maybe is that the space, while kind of big and very big, could become intimate and produce interesting views throughout, with a few moments tweaking here and there, and produce potentially interesting architectural effects. And this is actually the first headquarters we built, which is for a group called Upton's Naturals. They make vegan meat replacement stuff, and it's pretty interesting, and they're probably in your local supermarket at this point. When we met them, they were much smaller, and they were working in one place, living in another place, and they wanted to kind of pull everything together. And so this is a kind of a study in how can you, with a very, very modest budget, and a lot of program to squeeze into a tight space, can you actually play around with any kind of figural quality with this super low-tech strategy of precast panels. And so the kind of one move of shifting the panels up in one portion in order to invite the public in this case to a new cafe that they started just for this location. But at the same time, most of their work should be private because they have, it's not pretty putting this stuff together. So the first level is cafe and food processing plant. The second level is storage and office, and the third level is apartment and yoga studio. And it's all in 8,500 square feet, which is really not that much when you put all those things together. So it's almost like a three-dimensional sort of Tetris puzzle that fits together and somehow works. And what this is the cafe, office, processing, their apartment at the top floor, and their space for entertaining. They have events, and their yoga studio. This is their yoga studio, which also kind of has to function separately from everything else. So kind of complex, but in the end, fitting all together, and doing some technical things, but really we're not there yet. So getting larger in scale still. This is a project that we did together with Kelly Baer and some other faculty at UIC for a new campus performing arts building, which this is a couple years ago, is now kind of morphed into a different project that OMA New York is doing. But this was our thinking for it before it became a separate thing. But to take the campus and kind of invert it into a building that could change over time potentially, depending on building horizon and budget. So we started with this idea, and this is starting to kind of get closer to maybe a relationship between our completely theoretical work in the book and trying to kind of pull that into a real project. Then we start with these elements, that we design these elements each to have its own identity, and then we play with how they aggregate together and how they can both produce a figure and a field, both in plan and section. So playing around with these ideas, but also trying to fit 300,000 square feet of program into the project, to think about how two different faculties would come together, a visual arts faculty and a music and theater faculty, which don't necessarily want to be together, actually. And in academia, sometimes people don't really want to hang out together. But how could you actually produce both space that would make it convivial to kind of interact, but also to have disciplinary kind of depth and section so that you could do your own thing and actually produce silos on purpose, but then with the public space at the ground floor so that you could actually get both. So it sits on the edge of the campus. It wants to do everything for everybody all the time, like all clients. It has to function with these 4 very specific performing venues, and then also allow the artists to have their proper space to do their work. This is our, we like to make these dumb little gifts that are funny, and at least to us. I think it goes backwards too. And there it goes. Anyway, so when you cut the section through the building, there's invariably at least one courtyard, which brings light and air and visual relief deep into the building, which is a matte building, but kind of a matte building because it's 3 stories tall. So most matte buildings are not that tall, so it's a kind of combination of a number of things. And looking at that, and then looking at how it lives in the world. It's right next to the highway, so it becomes a symbol or a sign for the university that something new is possibly happening. And then how does it kind of live both on the street, at night? It changes with these fins that have glass behind them, so at night you kind of read the interior more than during the day when it seems a little more opaque. And then figuring out the kind of entry sequences and lobby spaces, because it should function both kind of for high culture and then also just every day down and dirty making things. That kind of, I think I could tie a direct connection between sort of the United Center work and some of the Death Valley work into this project. Getting kind of more larger and larger. This is basically a playground. We call it an outdoor learning center because it's for a school that's really interested in using play as part of pedagogy. We did lots of research with the faculty and the board, and it's really interesting. There's a direct correlation between playtime and how children's minds develop, how their brains develop, and crazy relationships between hanging upside down and like math skills, or doing climbing and maybe more obviously building up self-confidence. And so part of the problem with playgrounds today is that they are very safe and they feel very safe, but we wanted to design a playground that was safe but felt unsafe. Because actually, in our research, and it's actually true, children should actually be challenged and feel like there's something at risk. Even though there might not actually be anything at risk, they need to feel like there is in order to help their development. So that thing on the floor is not a kid, that's a doll. So this landscape, this is a resilient landscape that has quite a bit of recycled rubber on it so that you can actually fall from the 10 feet up and be okay. And so maybe this is a kind of microcosm of some of our ideas for the free water district, where we had this landscape that would collect water and also allow people to gather. So this is a kind of super micro level, a landscape that both has something kind of floating above it and that you could actually create a new space for gathering. And I showed the amphitheater beyond, which is literally a gathering space. And it's been very successful. Kids love it, so that's good. the rest of it is also thought about. This is a kind of nature area for the smaller kids to play with sand and water and at their speed. But this is a very small school, so kids are kind of all together, the big kids all the way up to 8th grade down to the 3-year-olds. So there needed to be some zones, but there's no walls in between it. So every once in a while there's a 3-year-old that decides that he or she wants to kind of climb the net, which is not a good idea. So they pull that kid off. And then over on the left is a farm that at the time of this drawing wasn't figured out, and a field in the middle, which is kind of normal. And this leads to actually the work we're doing with them now, which is to kind of think about the building itself. So we're thinking about a gymnasium for them and a library and a kind of new art wing that again, kind of pulling together this idea of figure and field, trying to think about how these things might live together in both the existing space and by themselves. So those are kind of just little, that's not a gift, that's just me. But this is a gift. This is a project that unfortunately is on permanent hold. But I still like it, and I feel like it fits within the kind of narrative of going from small to big. It is for another academic client. This is the School of the Art Institute in Chicago, and it is this building is right next to the school, right next to the Art Institute. But you never actually notice this building. It was designed by Walter Netsch. And it has seen better days. It needs to kind of be, the landscape in front of it needs to be rethought so that the kind of beauty of the building, which is pretty severe and an acquired taste, can be reappreciated. So the School of the Art Institute has no public space for its students. It's a very, it's in the loop in Chicago, and there's no public outdoor space for it. So we were commissioned to rethink the space in front of the School of the Art Institute building at this corner, and think about how we could take the existing plaza and reorganize it so that it could do more than be a lot of trees that are obscuring the building. And so we thought about this landscape, which is very related to the landscape, but a bit bigger, from the school that I just showed of the playground, and how we could activate the space, but also kind of make a separation between the city and the school. So we introduced these mounds, which underneath are tiny galleries for the school's students to display their work in, but on the other side produce these stepped landscapes that you can both hang out on and then maybe also do different types of programs. They have a fashion department that has a very significant fashion show once a year, so that could happen here. They have musicians, they could play here as well. There's different things that could happen. It could also be sculpture that's displayed and different types of art. So this sort of kind of direct relationship with the playground, but at a larger scale, and again, kind of pulling from the work that we're doing and the other part of our work, which is the more sort of theoretical. This is a model that we made that shows how the landscape both provides a kind of separation from this is totally not working. Oh yeah, no, anyway. From the street to the building to create this third space that's both sort of separate and part of the school and part of the city. It's a very deep space, so we kind of were thinking about how you kind of perceive it as you go by. This is actually changing, it's not your eyes, but sort of focusing deep into the space and also at the surface. Another thing that we have currently in construction that we're working with Epstein, which is a very large architecture engineering firm around the world, but with a big office in Chicago, is a bridge that we are teamed with them because of our kind of interest in water. This river is part of the Chicago River system. It is on the north side of the city. Here, the city was thinking about connecting with this yellow line on the left. This is the city's proposal of connecting a pedestrian path on one side of the river to a pedestrian path on the other side. And they were going to need to do some eminent domain and basically take some landscape or buy some landscape, a river edge from neighbors either side, and also create a very hard edge to the river in doing that. And we proposed that actually, based on research and a number of studies that we did together with Epstein, that in fact, if we pull the path from the edge of the river, they wouldn't have to eminent domain, the neighbors, and they could actually save the soft edge of the river by pulling the path into the river. And so this is a series of sections which show how we pull the path into the river and kind of wind it along the river, and so that we don't have to impact negatively the neighbors, but also produce a healthier river, because the soft edge is healthier condition than a hard edge would be. There's a little bit of hard edge. This is how it should look when it's done. It goes through the river, and this is it in construction, so you can see they've kind of pulled some earth over in order to kind of do the construction, but then that would be removed afterwards. And there's some kind of edge condition, hard edge condition, but further along, this is sort of a couple weeks ago, it is fully in the river and not impacting the edge. So that is a kind of positive development. So these ideas that kind of get played out at one scale somehow show up in another scale. And then for our biggest scale, we're looking at cities in China where they're actually doing kind of really large-scale work, so we can actually propose some of the ideas that we were thinking about in the book at a large scale. So this is a project in Hunan province. The site area is the pink on the right. There's a very historic old city along a river that eventually ends in the Yangtze River. And this river regularly floods the area that's outlined in the site. There's an existing kind of compromised sort of lake-ish thing, which we wanted to reorganize. And the size of it is comparing to Chicago. This is the center of the city in Chicago, so that's a scale of it. We are here actually testing our idea of the Eco Boulevard, which we proposed originally for the city of Chicago. And for the city of Chicago, it's too much to think about, but when you're kind of making doubling the size of your city in a couple of years, it seems to make sense for this city in China. And so here, this is a diagram of basically using the Eco Boulevard idea and a new refigured lake in the center to collect stormwater, clean it, and put it into this lake. And then actually, as the river can handle it, it still needs to get pumped into the river, but there was no way around kind of that portion of it. But this is a kind of maybe most direct relationship between the research I showed at the beginning and kind of what we can do with it. And so we refigured the lake for cultural reasons as well as technical reasons, and make these series of islands, which this is kind of overview of it. There's like 8 neighborhoods that we're designing at an urban scale. We're not doing the actual architecture of it, unfortunately, but maybe someday. But so we're proposing, and they're implementing this slowly now. this idea of the lake as a cultural idea, not only a technical thing, but that it's a place for collecting people and events and architecture and landscape together in order to see what interesting possibilities can shake out. And on the left is a section of one of the eco boulevards, so that basically all the water that falls in this zone can be passively collected and mostly passively cleaned, and then not passively pumped up, but eventually into the lake and then pumped into the river to keep going out of the region. So this is actually the Eco Boulevard on the left, kind of in a dry condition, and then the diagram of it when it's raining and collecting stormwater. So we designed at an urban design scale, in different neighborhoods in order to produce difference throughout the city. So it could be successful, central business district, a kind of exhibit district. Everybody needs a Soho these days, so kind of Soho district, an R&D district, various types of neighborhood districts, logistics district, and a kind of civic district. And the favorite one for us is the cultural district, which is a series of islands that have cute architecture on them that would be museums and theaters and a variety of places to go and spend your time. We looked at kind of important views, and this is a kind of diagram we made to prove to the client that you would get a really nice view of a significant mountain in the distance. The Eco Boulevard is now manifest as basically anything that you see that's orange is Eco Boulevard. Looking at different ways to produce, we did design kind of an idea for shopping district, neighborhood shopping districts, and basically just do all of this in 2 months. So we did that really fast. This is the cultural district, Soho. Eco Boulevard. I think I'm going the right way. The kind of expo district, more cultural district. So that led to another project in China. This one is, I think, this is the one that's part of the Rejected show. Is that still here? Okay. Yay. So this one, we won the last one. We didn't really win this one. So it was rejected. But a smaller city close by with even more water wants to develop further. And this one had a series of really important wetlands that we wanted to really be respectful of. And how do you do this real desire to develop smartly and so that you don't devastate the environment? And so we looked at this as creating both a way to develop, but also a way to sustainably develop, in that you could think about what in your city, what do you want to favor over other things. So in this case, favoring kind of a water-based economy. They ended up wanting to favor a sports-based economy. So the sports guys won. Whatever. So this is much bigger than the last one, so maybe harder to kind of drill down, but looking at, so we also, I don't know if you know Bertrand Goldberg, but he was a very important architect in Chicago, and sort of riffing on his architecture for the architecture of the city, and making kind of different precincts and different ways to, and here we're addressing a very soft edge, but we're not manipulating the edge. This is the existing edge, and we don't want to manipulate it because we don't want to mess it up. So we're kind of setting our insertions back from the edge of the water as much as we can. And this, different precincts again, cultural precinct, a expo precinct. Here's the thing that we exhibited here at the Rejected show, which is a little water tank plus restaurant in the middle of a kind of economic district. and residential districts that are tucked into these this really interesting ecology that we didn't want to mess up. This is the drawing that was submitted to your show, which is the little water tank with restaurant on top. So again, this one draws from one of the projects in the bowling book, which was the kind of little micro building that cleans water and also its program, so at a super small scale. And then the biggest project that we are doing recently is rethinking the Chicagoland area for 2050. We were commissioned by the Chicago Metropolitan Agency for Planning to look at the region with them. They produce every 10 years, they produce a white paper that is, in this case, 600 pages long, and it looks like this. It's a lot of text, and we worked together with them to visualize what this means. It took 2 years, because there's a lot of text. But to think about what Chicago is now, and then project based on their research and our thinking about the way that could be architecturalized to what Chicago and its environs could be in 2050. So there's lots of thinking about transportation, different modes of transportation. There were 3 main ideas that they wanted to work from to do much more equitable distribution of investment. So they would prioritize investment into areas that had not previously had enough investment in previous plans. And then we invented the architecturalization of these ideas, and work back and forth with them. So all of the ideas that we're working on in these images are reflecting their research policies. And so it's a lot. This is kind of it changing over time. There's also ideas about investment over time, so you can't change everything all at once. So we're looking also at how stuff develops over time, and thinking about that type of thing for them. And it's now their policy, it's part of their policy for the 2050 goal. And now we're actually working with them on rethinking the highway system in the region. And that's also going to take like a year. So you can see it would take a really long time to explain every one of these images. So I won't, but that work really comes from, again, kind of the research that we're doing. And then here, I just thought I would show you a couple of, I'm really almost done, I'm sure that you're exhausted, but some things that we're doing right now, which, again, kind of going back in scale, a concourse for our favorite one of our favorite Chicago architects, can't say only, Bertrand Goldberg. His most famous project in the city is the Marina City, also known as the Corncob Buildings. But looking at this kind of plinth area that you don't really sort of remember in the diagram, but it's got this public space, and we're trying to reorganize it for both the residential tenants and the commercial tenants, and produce a kind of public space for them that currently is really barren and not very fun to hang out in, and to kind of open it up in order to have views out. And also to introduce a Bertrand Goldberg Center for the city, which it surprisingly doesn't have right now. Another project we're doing for a chain restaurant in the US, inventing a prototype for them based on a lot of research of how they currently function and maybe how they might function in the future, and how they might appeal to people that they don't currently appeal to. We're also working with with a startup to develop a kit house. Everybody's into prefab. So we're trying, we'll see how it goes. We are also trying to self-develop 2 houses ourselves, which is going pretty slowly. This is on the Chicago's version of the High Line, which is not as fancy, but much longer than the High Line, way less fancy, like it's basically a sidewalk, elevated. But the site is right next to it, and so we're thinking about how do you build right next to it so that you could actually produce an effect to the public out of some very private things, which are houses. So these are not open to the public, but they might, along the 606, do something in a public way that might be interesting. And we're also looking with a developer for an addition to an existing building, actually rebuilding an existing building in the Gold Coast to produce basically doubling the size of the building by rebuilding it with a little tower that's we're showing it here as pink. We'll see how long we can get away with that. But thinking about that. And then, as I mentioned before, we're also looking at the highway system in Chicago with CMAP and thinking about that in the next year or so with them. Yeah, so thank you very much. Sorry, that was a lot. Yeah?
Thanks, Sarah. That was great. I'm curious about the first couple projects, and it's actually like I have a very, very simple question, because it seems like the references to Super Studio and these big radical projects that were addressing maybe global climate change and just like bigger political issues from an apocalyptic perspective, you seem to provide almost like the antithesis to that. Even the way that you do some of the big mega structural projects, they seem like a happy version of us in this voluntary prisoners or something like that. So my question is, how do you remain optimistic?
Oh, well, yeah. That's a good question. I think we remain optimistic, I think, because I think you need to try to be as optimistic as possible in order to engage these issues. You know, we're not always optimistic, but we feel that the kind of the optimism of the idea. I don't know, we kind of get attached to the possibility of actually doing something rather than giving up, that we could actually productively make an adjustment. So maybe, you know, to take as a reference the Darwin project rather than the Soviet project, and that we could maybe do some of these projects at some scale that would actually lead to both addressing the issue, but also be super productive for the cultural possibilities. I don't know how we remain optimistic. I'm not sure. I probably would have to get analyzed. But I think that it's a good question, because the Super Studio was not optimistic about it, and we're directly referencing them. They were critical. We're also critical. They were not that optimistic. We are optimistic. So we understand that we have a kind of different idea of like how to activate the ideas. But that maybe we just have to be different in order to move forward, because otherwise we'd just be doing exactly the same thing. I don't think that answered your question, but I'm not sure I know. Any other questions? Yeah?
I'm really interested in the concept of flooding Death Valley.
Uh-huh.
I'm pretty sure is this concept of like post global warming Death Valley has flooded and now we're building all this infrastructure here?
No, we're actually proposing to actively flood it, but not really proposing to actively flood it, because I know people who live in Palm Springs and they're like, no. So it's again, a kind of what if question, like what if you did that? Maybe that, because actually Death Valley is a type of basin that used to have water in it, so it's not that it never had water in it. It doesn't have water in it now, but it did have water in it many years ago. So it's kind of perfect for holding water, and it could produce these kind of really amazing microclimates, and it could be really cool. Of course, it's a crazy idea, but by playing the idea out, maybe we can have ideas for more realistic projects. Thanks. Yeah?
Can you talk about the advantage you see in such a graphic approach to the work, and then maybe like how you would generate new forms and part of the concepts?
Our graphic approach, and then second part?
How do you generate sort of new icons that drive the graphic approach in the work?
Oh, how we actually do it?
Yeah.
Well, we very purposely take a graphic approach, and we write about it in the book, that we are kind of like influenced not only by Super Studio and Archizoom and Archigram, but also like Murakami and Cute, the idea of Cute, and that is a kind of way that we think that we could do a kind of radical idea that might be familiar enough to be accepted by a larger group of people, that's why that's one of the reasons we're interested. Also, we're just interested in that kind of design work. The way we do it is like everybody, just like a lot of trial and error, I guess, just trying stuff. Yeah, so it's kind of developed, and we work things and then rework them, and so we do it kind of through an iterative process. Okay, all right, thank you very much.